So in this video, I want to talk about the behaviorist theory of language acquisition and sort of show how that gets manifested in teaching practices that we see today as the very first illustration of how SLA theory informed teaching and in ways that we're really still grappling with. And the kind of method that I want to talk about today is the audiolingual method. It was first known as the Army method, and we'll get into a little bit about that. But this is the kind of method, for those of you who watched the Pimsleur video, this is what Pimsleur does. It's basically still in the year 2021, it's offering this old audiolingual method. So the audiolingual method originally came from Leonard Bloomfield's work on indigenous languages of North America. So when he was trying to reconstruct the indigenous languages of North America back in the 1930s, and trying to figure out how they related to one another, where they may have come from, this sort of early work on linguistics, there's a few things that were true compared to other modern languages like French, Spanish, German, that the language education world was more interested in at that time. If you were trying to learn Fox or Lakota, there was no one really to overtly teach you how these languages work. What Bloomfield had to kind of do was become an informant to pioneer what we would now call field linguistics, where you're going into a society where there's no history of teaching this language to outsiders, and to just try to figure out ways to acquire the language, to learn the language as you become an insider just by asking questions. A lot of these languages, there was no writing involved. These were orate languages, languages that were spoken, not written down. So this method that he developed to learn these languages really privileged oracy over literacy. And in a lot of the cases, there was no or very little use of the L1. So obviously, humans had been learning languages for millennia by embedding themselves within a society and just having to learn the language from the ground up by speaking with people, by repeating what they said. But the methods that Bloomfield really implemented, which kind of had been being developed over the centuries into a full method, this sort of drew the attention later of the American Armed Forces, especially with the rise of Skinnerian behaviorist psychology. You might know from your undergrad classes about Benjamin Skinner, who basically said that learning works by stimulus response pairing, that you have a habit and that we need to change the habit through either positive reinforcement, giving you some kind of a reward if you change the habit, or negative reinforcement. If you continue with the habit, you get punished in some way. And you might think of Pavlovian dogs or all of this kind of behaviorist learning through reinforcement, through punishment and reward. And this was sort of the cutting edge in the field of psychology at the time. So basically what Bloomfield did, was to memorize dialogues, to capture dialogues, to memorize them, to repeat them. And once you had the memorized dialogues, you could kind of bootstrap your way into the grammar. You could take the dialogues that were coming out of your mouth that you had recorded and learned, and then try to figure out what the different syllables that were coming out of your mouth might meant, what the order would be, what the grammar would be within those dialogues. And we see several kinds of descendants. So the Army was interested in this around the time of World War II, because huge groups of people had to learn languages for which there were no real college classes. There wasn't a tradition of language teaching, that there had to be a way of learning the language just by being exposed to language data and conversations themselves. There was no textbooks. And also the goal of most military officers who are trying to use the language is to interact. It's not to write treatises or to write academic reports. It's to understand what people are saying to each other in the field, listening in on for purposes of intelligence, and then speaking to people. So the Army and then later the Peace Corps really adopted this as well, as the Peace Corps in the 1960s was sending people to work in language communities where there was no real history of language teaching to outsiders or no pre-existing materials. The Peace Corps had to develop methods of helping the Peace Corps volunteers learn the local languages, learn the host languages, purely via conversations and recording memorized dialogues. And you'll see this kind of tradition of using dialogues and then sort of unpacking the conversation within it, starting with repeat after me and kind of repeating line by line in a dialogue. It probably sounds familiar to you. Pimsleur uses it, but also Rosetta Stone, Duolingo, the Teach Yourself series, most of the language learning products that you could find on your cell phone or you could find in a bookstore are basically still just fancier and fancier incarnations of audiolingual learning, where you start with the ear, the audio part, and then it works your way across the tongue, the lingual part. Right, ear, tongue based learning. Listen and repeat. Memorize the dialogue and then slowly figure out what's the grammar and vocabulary contained in that dialogue. Another part of audiolingual learning then involved drills. And obviously, for a thing that's adapted by the military is definitely used to drills, practicing the same techniques over and over again and honing those techniques. So there could be repetition drills where the teacher would say whiteboard, students say whiteboard, teacher says chalk, students say chalk. So a repetition drill. An inflection drill where you have the students kind of in chorus repeating after each other, like a singular plural drill. I ate the sandwich. The students say, I ate the sandwiches, or we ate the sandwiches, like to practice inflecting. Replacement drills, he bought the car for half price. He bought it for half price. I brought my sister to school. I brought her to school. So doing these replacement drills and restatement drills. Tell me not to smoke so often. Don't smoke so often. Tell me to read the book. Read the book. So these sorts of drills, there's a lot of choral repetition back and forth over and over again in iterations ad infinitum. This is what language classes looked like in the 1950s and 60s, almost universally. And many of the products that we have today still involve these kinds of drills, and in many places in the world, this is honestly what language classes still look like. An example of this, a Korean textbook that I used when I was learning Korean in South Korea. This was back in 2006, 7, 8. So Sogang Daehakyo, Sogang University is like one of the most renowned universities in Korea for teaching foreigners the Korean language. And here we basically have substitution drills. And this is what the whole textbook series was made of. This guy's saying lately, and then this guy's thinking, doing a part-time job. So we basically have this dialogue. Andy, what have you been doing lately? Working part-time. Why? Soon I want to travel, so I'm working part-time. And then what you would see here is you would have a list of other things to substitute it with. Wherever I had working part-time, now I'm going to replace it with studying Korean, studying Chinese, learning Taekwondo, or the verbs to travel, to study in a Korean university, to go to China to teach Taekwondo. So I would just swap out elements of this dialogue for a new one. Andy, what have you been doing lately? Studying Korean. Why? Soon I want to study in a Korean university, so I'm studying Korean. What are you doing lately? Studying Chinese. Why? Soon I want to go to China. So the learners would be just asked to rewrite these dialogues over and over again, swapping out the different elements. And basically, the learning mechanism here, the acquisition theory behind this is behaviorism. You're trying to build a new habit. You're trying to change your old habits, your old English habits, and replace them with Korean habits. And the only way to build a new habit is to do something over and over and over again. And the teachers were trained to give things like very good, or a gold star, or a smile, if the habit was repeated correctly. The teachers were trained to punish learners, give them negative reinforcement if it was done wrong, with a red mark, or an angry sound, or a saying like, that's wrong, try again. So that through this positive or negative reinforcement, you would slowly replace your old habits with new habits and have more learning done. And here we can see another example of a dialogue, lots of different kinds of pictures that you would have replaced. And here's a written task that's based on this, that I'm supposed to practice these drills. And like this, the old sort of PPP, present, practice, produce, is basically based on behaviorist learning, that you present, this is how this thing works, this is the new habit I want you to acquire. Okay, I'm going to practice it over and over and over again in small contexts until you've built up the new habit, and then you can demonstrate that the new habit has been successfully acquired when you are tested to produce the language in a new and more complete way. Duolingo does this. It gives you overt reinforcement with green and red, the colors, to say if you've done something right or done something wrong. It's basically asking you to translate things over and over again. And it's trying to teach you the grammar by making you go through the motions of physically reorganizing the elements, building a new habit, building new associations slowly over time, linking the boy with El Niño instead of with El Gato or El Perro. And these Duolingo screens, or these Rosetta Stone screens where you're asked to click on the picture that you see, illustrating the Arabic phrase as presented here. This is all behaviorist learning here, where I'm building new habits through repetitive drills over and over. Now, obviously, some parts of language acquisition are going to benefit from this kind of drill-based learning, but not everything. So, like any theory, the field advances when a theory is proven to be insufficient. If we go back into the time period of the behaviorist age, the 1950s and the 1960s, and think about, well, what were the assumptions about language learning that made this approach to language acquisition the most popular? I mean, not only was it incorporating the most cutting-edge psychological research at its time and trying to implement that and apply that to language acquisition, something we'll see all through this course, people trying to apply new psychology to language acquisition. There were also some sociocultural factors that were true at that time, which made this seem like the obvious solution. For most learners in the 1950s, learners were not likely to need to communicate in the language very often. What learners were asked to do or expected to do was be able to read works of literature in the original language and to produce translations. The world travel was much more the reserve of the elite. There wasn't as much migration. The expectation wasn't that you were going to be engaging in joint problem solving in the target language, but that you were mostly going to be accessing cultural products at a distance. International travel was rare, and there was this idea of like a melting pot ideology for the newcomers who were bringing languages into the United States as well. The thought was that communication skills could also be adduced by developing literary reading skills. So eventually, adding to the audiolingual method in the behaviorist age, you had a lot of translation drills, which were designed to build your literary skills, and that the classes at this time would feature a lot of translating great works. Like if you found yourself in an Italian class, your assignments would be translating passages out of Italian into English, and the teacher would actually be correcting the accuracy of your English translation rather than you actually communicating in Italian. And the thought was that if you could read and translate, you would automatically be able to speak it. That literacy would be maybe in the lead and oracy follow in the later stages of behaviorist learning. And this was not true at all. It was more like the other way around, what the audiolingual thought is that literacy could follow oracy, that when people did build oral skills, that then they found themselves able to read. So that's kind of the behaviorist psychology and the audiolingual method, which had its roots in that, as well as its roots in older needs and older stages in the development of linguistics. But whether we're talking about behaviorism or any of the other linguistic theories that are available, second language acquisition theories, Bill Van Patten and Jessica Williams in 2015, there's a newer version of this book that just came out 2018. But they list 10 observations that any SLA theory must account for. And I think this is really interesting. These are things that are so irrefutably true, the things that no second language acquisitionist would disagree with, that if your theory somehow can't account for these facts, we're going to be extremely skeptical of this theory. One is that exposure to input is necessary for second language acquisition. Again, that's not that surprising that you would need to hear or read language in order to be able to learn it. But again, they're trying to come up with the baseline. What is the base set of facts that we need to account for in any SLA theory? And most SLA theories then would differ on what exactly is the mechanism through which we process input. No one would argue that input is essential. A good deal of SLA happens incidentally. This means we come to learn things that we were never explicitly taught. That as a teacher, I might be explicitly teaching my learners something, but that as long as the learners are reading and listening and using, they're going to learn things incidentally. They're going to learn things I never intended to teach them, but they just find themselves learning. So there's got to be a mechanism for incidental learning as well as for intentional learning. Learners come to know more than what they've been exposed to in the input. It seems like there's some parts of language knowledge that learners get for free or that never actually appear in the input they're exposed, and yet they know. And this may seem a little bit abstract. I want to try to give an example of this. It's perfectly fine in English to say, who did he claim that he has met? So he has met someone. He has met who? That who can be extracted out of this green embedded sentence and raised up to the top, I can ask a question out of this embedded clause. In this case, who did he claim that he has met? And that he has met is the object of the verb claim, claimed something. So when the embedded clause is the object of a verb, then I can question something out of it. A very similar sentence, who did he make the claim that he has met? Most speakers of English find this one a lot more awkward. That's what this asterisk means. And I can't question out of this clause that he has met when it's in this relationship to claim. Here, the embedded clause is the object of the verb claim. Here, claim is a noun. And the embedded clause that he has met, it's called a relative clause, is describing more about this noun claim, is restricting the set of claims that I'm talking about. In this case, it's specifying a single type of claim, this kind of relative clause or adjective clause. Well, this isn't just a fact with the English language, it's a fact of almost every human language that's been studied. But learners of English actually do extremely well at this test right from the very beginning. They have an intuition that this one is possible and that this one is impossible that they get for free. They've never had any English data that that's true, but this seems to be a language universal. It's unconscious knowledge, things that learners are bringing into the learning process at the beginning. This is part of what Noam Chomsky would have called universal grammar. Oh, this is a little bit overlapped, but it says learners' output often follows predictable paths with predictable stages in acquisition. While there's a lot that varies from individual learners, in terms of certain grammatical structures, it seems like there's a clear and highly predictable order in terms of which order these things are acquired in. Second language learning is variable in its outcome, unlike childhood language acquisition, where all children, unless they have a neurological disability or very different neurological abilities, all children who are exposed to human language acquire it absolutely perfectly. There's very little variation in child language acquisition, almost none. Whereas we find that second language learning, by which we mean like adult language learning, is highly variable in its outcome. People as individuals perform very differently in terms of how successfully they acquire those things. Language learning is variable across linguistic subsystems, by which I mean the pronunciation system, vocabulary system, the grammar system, and the pragmatics or cultural system here, the discursive system. So that language, you can have people who are excellent at acquiring phonology but not grammar, or vice versa. And what could explain that? How can individuals differ in those ways? Or is it that instructional methods are more to blame why some people struggle in one of these subsystems than another? That's something that an SLA theory would have to account for. There are limits on the effect of frequency on SLA. You would think that frequent things would be easy to acquire and infrequent things would be hard to acquire. And yet we discovered that there are highly frequent things which are very difficult to acquire and things which are very infrequent which are nonetheless fairly easy to acquire. So hardness and easiness of acquisition is not always just a matter of how frequent something appears in the input. That would be kind of like a claim there's a limit to the input. It's not just about how many times you hear something. There are limits on the effect of a learner's first language. In behaviorist thinking, when you had people like Lotto and Fries and comparative linguistics, they said every problem that a speaker has in learning a new language is because it contradicts a habit in their first language. The reason you struggle with Japanese is because you have a brain that works as an English brain. It's full of English habits. I need to just break you of all of your English habits, teach you some Japanese ones, and then things will be fine. But it turns out that the first language does not explain everything. It explains some things, but there's got to be other sources of interference and other sources of influence besides the learner's first language, because we see some things are difficult to acquire no matter what the first language is, and some things are easy to acquire no matter what the first language is. So it's not a simple method of just comparing two languages side by side, identifying the differences, and then assuming that any difference that exists is going to be hard, and we just need to break habits. That was the assumption based in most audiolingual learning, and even some of the translation-based teaching methods like grammar translation that was also rooted in behaviorist psychology. There's limits on the effect of instruction on SLA. There's going to be some things you can teach till you're blue in the face. You can teach till the cows come home, and probably it's not going to change your learners at all. And then there are some things that you don't ever need to teach, but learners will get it as long as they're exposed to the input and the data, which is a fascinating finding, sometimes a little trouble, but it's a good humbling fact for language teachers. So that's something that has to be accounted for. And there are limits on the effect of output production on SLA. Output certainly helps. It helps to speak and it helps to write in the language. And yet there are examples of language skills and even individual language learners who had almost no chances for output in their acquisition process, but were still able to acquire the language to a large degree. So these are 10 things that are true that would have to be accounted for by any theory of second language acquisition that you might want to pick up and analyze. And I would like to close this little video by talking about 5 very elemental hypotheses that you'll see introduced in the first chapters of our textbook, and that we'll be referring to. You might have been familiar with these already in your P&P class. The first is the interlanguage hypothesis by Larry Salenker. This basically says, if I'm a learner of a language, what I speak at a given moment, what is in my head, is something that's is something that's partly my first language, partly the language I'm trying to learn, and then partly it's drawing on other sources. And so it's not the actual language itself. If I'm a learner of French, I'm not actually speaking and performing in a way that every French speaker would recognize, yes, that is French. Often I'm speaking an interlanguage, something that still definitely shows signs of my English L1 influence on my French. It definitely shows signs of French influence. And then there's things that I'm doing that come neither from my English nor are they like French, but are maybe just sort of universal best guesses that learners make, or maybe even influence from other languages that I know, like German, Russian, Spanish. And so it's my best working model of the language is the interlanguage. And as a learner of French who didn't grow up speaking it from childhood, that's maybe the best I can ever do, is to have a best working hypothesis, a best working model of what I think French is and how it works. The input hypothesis, proposed by Stephen Krashen, is that input is not only just necessary for language acquisition, but that it's sufficient. That what learners need is really input alone, and through input alone, they'll be able to acquire the language. This we'll dig into in more depth in Chapter 2 of our textbook. The interaction hypothesis, by Michael Long, is that input isn't sufficient. You need input and interaction, and that it's actually in the process of interacting with another human being that you get the feedback, you get the language data, which is most nutritious, which is most usable to a language learner. And that's baked into a lot of the SLA theories we might look at. Merrill Swain's output hypothesis is that output isn't just practicing what you know, but that in making output and producing language and speaking and writing, you are actually learning the grammar. You're reorganizing your best working model. You're reorganizing your interlanguage and improving it through your output. And the noticing hypothesis by Schmidt, that something, just because it's in front of your eyes or in front of your ears, it's input, that doesn't mean that it's actually going to be of any use to you as a language learner. Not all of the input that you're exposed to is actually going to become intake, is actually going to be data which is useful to feeding your internal system. In order for it to be useful, you have to notice it and probably ultimately have to process it. And not every bit of language data that you're exposed to is going to be something you notice. That noticing is the gatekeeper for language acquisition. So this is a background on sort of one of the early theories of language acquisition and how it affected how teaching was done in ways we recognize, and a little bit of basic foundation to some of the hypotheses that we're going to be reading about in the chapters 1 and 2 in our textbook.